Hey, welkom allemaal bij deze eerste bijeenkomst van de 19e conferentie voor onderzoeksjournalistiek. En het is de meest rare conferentie die we het afgelopen jaar gehouden hebben, want hij is alleen online. Helaas, het kan niet anders vanwege de coronamaatregelen. Maar het was voor ons geen optie om geen conferentie te houden. Dit zijn zo belangrijke tijden. Wat voor positie je als media, die van waakhond of die als schoothond van het beleid. Hoe kritisch ben je? Hoe doe je onderzoek in deze rare omstandigheden? Hoe doe je je werk? Dat zijn belangrijke dingen die we met iedereen willen bespreken. Hoe blijven we kritisch in deze crisistijd? We weten ook wat we missen. We missen leren van elkaar. Want dit blijft behelpen op deze methodes, maar leren van elkaar. We missen de wandelgangen. We missen het diner. We missen de borrel. We missen de karaokebar diep in de nacht. Dat zijn alle dingen die we natuurlijk missen. En we beseffen dat en we gaan dat volgend jaar helemaal goed maken als we allemaal ingeënt zijn. Of een sneltest hebben bij de ingang. Maar dat gaan we allemaal goed maken. Maar dit keer hebben we wel een fantastische gast hier. Zo. Ik ben trouwens Ewald de Vos. Ik ben voorzitter van de VVOJ. En naast me zit Koen van der Ven. En die was binnen het bestuur verantwoordelijk voor het programma van de conferentie. Ik heet jullie van harte welkom allemaal. Ik denk dat we een fantastische sessie nu gaan doen aan de vooravond van de conferentie die morgen, volgens mij, laat begint om 9:30, toch? Ja. Om 9:30 begint die live vanuit Pakhuis de Zwijger. Dan zien we jullie vast allemaal ook weer. En Koen gaat nu verder met de introductie van het programma van de komende 2 uur.
Ja, absoluut. Want zoals Ewald al zei, de kern van wat de VVOJ is, hebben we proberen te behouden dit jaar. En dat is uiteindelijk dat we eens per jaar het moment hebben om met elkaar even de competitie aan de kant te schuiven en van elkaar te leren, het vak te verbeteren. Dus morgen echt officieel van start. Maar nu, de reden dat we nu alvast bij elkaar zijn, is omdat we een keynote speaker hadden die vandaag tijd voor ons kon maken. En this is where I'll switch to English, because our keynote speaker here is Adam Tooze. You already see him on your screen. I think a lot of colleagues already know him, especially those colleagues occupied with financial journalism, covering economics. But for those people who don't, he's a professor at Columbia University, and I think most importantly in this context, he wrote, you could say, the book about the financial crisis, called Crashed: How a Decade of Financial Crisis Changed the World. And today, of course, there it is. So print screen for those who haven't read it. Today we are facing a different crisis. Evert already told you. A health crisis in first instance, but one that unavoidably will also affect our economy. We see a government that is investing into the economy now. We see people losing their jobs. We are facing maybe a context which is different from the last crisis, but there might also be similarities. And I think this is why we, as the board of the VVOJ, thought it to be important to invite Adam Tooze over to ask him how to approach this. What can we learn from the last crisis? What mistakes can we prevent? What methods can we learn from him that we can use ourselves? So that's why, once again, Adam Tooze is here. This is normally the moment that everybody clap, but we have to, I think, sort of visualize that. And I'm pretty sure people are clapping at the editorial floors now, that's for sure. The other man that I would like to introduce to you is the man who will be interviewing Adam Tooze today. That's Ewald Engelen. Also, definitely not unknown by most of us, professor of financial geography at the University of Amsterdam. And most people here in the room will know him as from his many publications at places like Follow the Money, the Groene Amsterdammer, or the many other places where this self-proclaimed gentleman hooligan appears. Ewald, Adam, the floor is yours. I'll leave the room now and have fun. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Now already, thank you for being here.
Okay.
It's an honor and a pleasure, Adam, to have you here with us. The introduction that I had prepared in terms of where you're located, I can skip because that's already been done. But what is important also for what I'm going to ask you is to notice that you are an historian. You occupy a chair of history at Columbia University. You serve as the director of the European Institute. You are, true to type, a historian. And I want to talk to you about that in 3 different ways. We're going to go through them in that order. First, the intellectual trajectory that you have taken, which for now has ended with Crashed, the book that I already showed. It's this one, in my opinion, the best book written about the great financial crisis that broke in 2008. For now, because it may well be the case that in a couple of years there will be another one, but for now it is absolutely the best book. Secondly, I want to talk to you about your methods, the approach you've taken in order to collect the very rich information, data and insights that ultimately can be found within the covers of Crashed. And finally, because you are, of course, and especially since you published Crashed, you are one of the, it's more than a handful, but it's a limited number of people who can truly claim to be a global public intellectual. You are an academic, but you increasingly manifest yourself also as an intellectual. So I wanted to end with a couple of questions about your take on the current geopolitical conjuncture, if that is okay with you.
Yes, good.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, then let's start with the first part. I've followed your intellectual trajectory. You started out with publishing about the German state. You did something about the fragility of democracy post World War I. You famously wrote a big tome on the Nazi political economy during the Second World War, Wages of Destruction. And then the follow-up was Deluge, a book that I've also read with much interest, which talks about the interbellum and the geopolitical shift and all the problems that brought with it from the US to the UK. But if you sort of oversee your publications up until 2018, when Crashed was actually published, I would describe you as a historian who is a specialist in the interbellum, like many other historians. And in a sense, and that is the question that I want to pose to you, your sort of decision to write a book about not settled history, but about history in the making, which of course was the great financial crisis at the moment when you must have decided to tackle that particular topic, seems to mirror that of Barry Eichengreen, a famous economic historian, also a specialist in the interbellum, who was inspired by the great financial crisis to write a book which he called Hall of Mirrors, which is an investigation of the differences as well as the similarities between the Great Depression of the 1930s and the Great Recession of the 2010s. And my question then is this indeed also, has this also been the main sort of motive for you to start collecting the material which ultimately became Crashed?
Oh, thank you for that question. Thank you for having me on this as on this show, I want to say, and thank you, Ewald, for taking the time for this conversation. I mean, it's a big sort of quasi autobiographical question or biographical question that you ask.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, you're right, of course. I hold a chair. I'm very, very fortunate to hold a chair as a professor of history at Columbia and delighted to be in the history department. And I am preoccupied with history and have spent many years doing classically archivally driven historical work.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I wouldn't reject, as it were, my identification as a historian. But I think, and the parallel to Barry Eichengreen is useful here. So Barry Eichengreen is a professor of economics at Berkeley, an economist, first and foremost, who has, throughout his career, taken a very productive and fertile interest in history. And I would think of myself as a sort of the mirror image of Eichengreen, in the sense that I actually started out as an economist. So if you want to understand, if you like, if you were so interested, if you were interested to understand the rails on which I run, the intellectual rails, they're not, well, they're social scientific. So I mean, my first degree is in economics, not in history. I did my PhD in an economic history department in the London School of Economics, which is a very economics heavy department. The questions that I ask are of a general nature about the history of modernity. So they are questions about power. That's, I think, the common denominator: power and knowledge, power and the state, power and the economy. I have an abiding interest in military history. I teach military history. I've taught at West Point. So that is, as it were, those are the rails on which I run intellectually, which is why I wouldn't, you're absolutely right that I started out working on the early 20th century. But in a sense, because that's where the problems were that I was interested in, not because I was, as it were, a kind of a historian committed to a particular period and then necessarily interested laterally in everything that was going on in that period. I have a set of sort of, like I said, intellectual rails and that gives me a mobility in the same way that Eichengreen has, because, like on rails, you can run quite quickly. It's restricted, right? It only covers a certain field, and that's crucial. And as fat as some of my books are, I think of all of them as sort of in the mode of a social scientist, as sort of thought experiments, Gedankenexperimente, right? Let's see if we look at this period under this aspect, what we can see. In terms of in econometrics, it's, how big is your R squared? How much of the variation are you picking up with the particular model that you use? And so and the questions that occupied me, well, I got into writing about the financial crisis while I was in the middle of doing Deluge. I began to be very preoccupied with the way in which journalists and contemporaries were thinking about the events around us at that moment as historical and labeling it historical, and up to and including the point that an economic historian like Ben Bernanke was actually running the Fed at the time, right? So history was, and because I come from a left-wing political background, because I've been deeply interested in social theory all my life, I've also been fundamentally interested in questions of philosophy of history. And so whilst I was writing Deluge, I became interested almost in a hobby kind of fashion in collecting documents, collecting speeches by actors like Ben Bernanke or economists like Paul Krugman, who were thinking the crisis as history. And I started out teaching a course at Yale of the most specialist type, which was not a history of the crisis, but an analysis of the ways in which the crisis was being historicized. In other words, how it was being talked about. And
when was that?
2013. And that was also a moment I felt that we had a degree of narrative closure. I mean, you say that I launched into writing that book when everything seemed open, and you're absolutely right by the time it appeared, but this is the way that history can play tricks on you, right? Because in 2013, it felt like we had closure. Why did we have closure? Because of whatever it takes, from Draghi in the summer of 2012, because Barack Obama had won re-election. And so that, as it were, provided what turned out, of course, to be a very false sense of security. But that was the launching pad from which I set out on the project. And but it turned out to be kind of vain project, because you can only go so far in assessing Paul Krugman, Ben Bernanke, Reinhard and Rogoff's views of history before actually having to elaborate your own view of history. And that's when I actually started digging in. And as soon as I did that, I realized that it in fact was on my rails. This was familiar terrain, because my earlier books, the organizing idea is really, there were two big organizing ideas, or big or not, like there were two organizing ideas. One is, as it were, how the world deals with the rise of American power. And the other one was how on earth we came to understand the modern economy, or the economy the way we do. My first book was about the history of economic statistics. The other two books, Deluge and Crash, and Wages of Destruction, were about, as it were, the reactions of the world, starting with Nazi Germany, but then looking much more broadly in Deluge to the rise of American power. And as soon as I started trying to answer this question in 2013, 2014, okay, if Krugman, Ben Bernanke, Reinhard and Rogoff, and all the others, Rajan, the whole penumbra, the people in New Left Review, if they see 2008 this way, what is my account? I ended up, perhaps not surprisingly, producing another one of my accounts. In other words, an account that was driven by these questions of what the economy is at this moment and how American power functions. in the transatlantic context, and then with wider ramifications. And so to that extent, crash may feel like a huge leap from Wages or Deluge, but in a sense, it's, and also from my first book on the history of statistics, but in a sense, it's actually intellectually a continuation of the same project, the same set of questions, to a different epoch, to one much closer to the present, and one in which I am directly entangled as opposed to vicariously entangled through memory and through family connections and so on. Yeah. But that's how it happened. It went from being a sort of antiquarian philosophical interest in what is happening to being, you know, this familiar problems. And then, as you say, as you pointed out in your introduction, it's become totally immersive. So now, you know, journalists who write about 2020 do so through the lens, in part, of crash. That sounds incredibly big-headed, but I happen to know it's true about many of the editorial offices. And part of the reason for that, and this is where we will link up to another thread, is that crash is, of course, essentially a distillation. My main sources are journalists writing about 2008-9. So in a sense, my book is a sort of aestheticized, comprehensive, rather imposing, because it's fat and big, and Penguin published it.
Sure, with a lot of references.
But it's a summation, really, of journalistic knowledge about what happened in 08-09. So I feel native to that community and am treated as such now. Twitter amplifies that. So in a sense, I've gone through three stages of starting in a very philosophical position, then actually having to articulate a narrative, and then finding myself now, I mean, whether I like it or not, you know, I'm going to get emails from Financial Times, from The Guardian, from the Wall Street Journal saying, what do you think? Like, can I have a talk to you? And, you know, this is why I'm here, because, I mean, one of your colleagues, one of Jeff Portman's, like, I've had several conversations with him. That's how it's happened.
Two questions related to what you just said. First of all, what I have always find quite striking is that especially people like the ones you mentioned, Krugman, Bernanke, Rogoff and Reinhardt, of course, being true to type economists, nevertheless saw very clearly the historical parallels between what happened in the 30s and what was happening in Actu in 2008. And one of the motives that they had for making these public interventions, writing these books, but also writing these op-eds and trying to find a hearing for their concerns, was that they were worried. They were worried about, we know what happened in the 1930s, and they were worried that some kind of a right-wing populist backlash might occur if we again mismanage this. Did you have similar kind of almost political, philosophical, or moral considerations for jumping on this particular big event, which we now call the Great Financial Crisis?
I can't claim to have had at the time. I have gone through myself a dramatic personal development in this respect, and I would call it a development or an evolution since 2008. At the time of the events themselves, I have to say, I was busy writing Deluge. I had a young child. We were moving house from the Cambridge to the US. I became politicized. Well, I was always a political person, but in a rather ivory tower armchair kind of way, not as a young person, but increasingly in the first stages of my academic career. And then I arrived in the US, and it has, I think, that also that depoliticization, which happens to me, has something to do with the flavor of British academia. I was at Cambridge for many years. It is, quintessentially part of the British establishment, and yet not in the way an institution like Yale is, which is where I ended up in the United States, or now Columbia. The way in which let's call it an elite, for want of a better word, and I don't imply anything normative by that, I just mean, as it were, the networks of power operate sociologically. In the United States is unlike anywhere I know in Europe. I mean, there is a continuous, and it's going on right now, literally as we speak, between academic departments of all types and the political appointees at the top of government in Washington. And in ambitious undergraduates, ambitious young people at universities like that, it creates the expectation of engagement, because if not you, who? This was also, of course, the moment of Occupy. I had many students in the seminars that I was teaching who were, in the encampment and lived there for weeks on end and were part of the organic intellectual group that emerged out of Occupy. And I am, if I have any kind of identity, because I'm a migrant, I moved when I was very little and have continued moving ever since. But if I have any attachment to any space politically, it's the EU, oddly, of course, because I'm stuck with a British passport. But I grew up in West Germany in the 70s and 80s, and it's really, and to see what was happening in the EU, really not so much at the time of the immediate crisis when my mind was on other things, but in the aftermath, in the phase of austerity, and then in Greece, of course, in 2015,
sure,
that in too forced me into a zone. And as a result now, that has become an absolutely essential part of my engagement. And of course, there's a long history of thinking about this in the discipline of history. History in the 19th century emerged, and academic history as we know it emerged in conjunction with the emergence of European nation states. Western history is intimately, umbilically tied up with the project of nation making in the 19th century.
Absolutely.
And there is a tradition which has, as it were, very negative exponents, who people, liberals at least, think of as very negative exponents. Treitschke in Germany would be the most obvious case. But as the more I've been involved in this kind of interface, the more sympathy I have begun to feel for that tradition, because whether I like it or not, that is what I'm engaged in. And so I think then the question, of course, is how you discipline that, how you try and how you write things which are not merely, as it were, partisan texts of interest only to people who agree with you, and how you write things which aren't merely contributing to the balkanizing and closing of minds that many of us bewail in the public sphere right now. So there are a whole series of pitfalls, but if I'm honest, I don't really see how I can proceed any other way. And furthermore, intellectually, it has been, the most productive dialectic, the most productive dynamic I've ever exposed myself to. And it has not been stable. It has not been reinforcing of what I thought I knew at the very beginning. On the contrary, it has been continuously disturbing, starting with the basic premise on which I began Crash, which was this story is closed, right? And we can write the story. So I actually would now advocate that all historians write at least one contemporary history book, because you suddenly realize what every journalist, of course, knows, which is the acute conjunctural sensitivity, the total dependence of your point of view on a story, on the moment at which you formulate it, and the total dependence of the significance of the story when you publish it, for better or worse, positive, negative, or just irrelevant, on when you publish it and the moment that you publish it, right? So the triangulation between the observer, the audience, and the subject matter is so dynamic in contemporary reportage. And all historians abstractly know that is the case, even when they're writing about the Middle Ages, right? We know that medieval history written in the time of the Nazis was different from medieval history written in the 1980s or 90s. But if you've attempted to write the history of the recent past for an immediate audience, it's like a roller coaster of terrifying, it's an incredibly invigorating and slightly addictive kind of thing to be doing.
I had a question about that, but you've basically already answered it, indicating, well, hey, if you write about the first half of the 20th century, you could in a sense say it's settled history, but as you already indicated, history is never settled. There's always this. It's always put to new usage, political usages, etc., etc. But dealing with the recent past, basically, and there is always this saying: journalists write the first draft of history, and historians the second and the third. But you, in a sense, did write the first draft of history on the back of the crisis, although you dependent, as you indicated, to a huge extent on the writings that journalists had already conducted. But it's of course a very clear case of history not being settled, resulting in the roller coaster that you just mentioned. So this is basically the first set of questions that I had. Now let's move to Crash, because that sort of comes naturally. As I already indicated, one of the best, and perhaps one of the best books on the great financial crisis written so far. The book, as such, as you indicated, it seemed as if the narrative around the crisis was closed. But you dug deeper, and from that deeper digging came, of course, all sorts of hidden, or at least not easily obtainable information, data, and insights, which indicated that there was a completely different story to be told about the crisis. So if I may capture the main drift of Crashed with one word, it basically unmasked the settled stories that were told about the crisis as being clearly politically infused and biased. And what the book as such did was basically opening up, breaking through the crust of these political, ideological narratives in order to point out what was really going on during the crisis. And I have an example of that, and that simultaneously gives us a chance to talk about your tools of the trade, your approach and your method. Just like you, I have also been interested in the crisis right from the start, started to collect all sorts of information. And I was struck by the way in which the storyline, especially here in Europe, was that it was an American crisis. It originated in residential mortgage-backed securities, which were constructed by Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, and what have you. They simply made too much of them built on real estate values, which suddenly lost their value due to all sorts of weird constructions with regard to the mortgage contracts themselves. But it had nothing to do with European banks. And as you indicated, and a couple of other people have done the same, European banks were hugely involved. Basically, everything that had to do with the junk bonds built on American real estate were bought by European banks. So the European banks were very much at fault. Risk management of European banks was absolutely lacking. So that whole narrative was by you unmasked as a clearly political narrative. But in order to be able to do that, you had to delve pretty deep into the data sources provided by the Federal Reserve, especially of New York, the Bank of International Settlements, and all sorts of specialized reports. How did you obtain that information, and what guided your search for this particular type of information? Because there is so much around. The finance as such before 2008 was this very professionalized, depoliticized sphere. Gillian Tett has called it a silo over which social silence rested. No one was really interested. And then after 2008, the flotsam and jetsam of the crisis produced all these tidbits of data, but they were still requiring some sort of collecting and a constructing of the narrative. You did that. How did you do that? And what guided your intuitions about where to look? And what sources were the most relevant and most useful to you in order to construct again the wonderful story, and also the quite critical unmasking story that you tell in Crashed?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this because I knew I was going to do this event with you in a forum of investigative journalists, and
Sure,
I was thinking, so I mean, you pinged the question to me in an email. So what is the difference between what you do, or what is the similarity? And I would say I was entirely parasitic, dependent on work done by investigative journalists, insofar as I was using the sorts of sources they uncovered. I am not an investigative journalist. I'm not an investigative researcher in that sense at all. That isn't my method. The way I approached the problem was, I'm tempted to say, if you think about investigation, one's tempted to use metaphors like depth or behind the scenes or that kind of revelatory. And you kindly described this book as an unmasking. And I know exactly what you mean, because in a sense, it's certainly a critique of ideology. It's a critique of certain sorts of narrative.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
But the way I proceeded was, in fact, to take sources which, yes, they're technical, but they're in no way secret. They're in no way. There's one, I'll come to it in the end. There is one, as it were, thing that was forced into the open by the use of freedom of information law in the United States by journalists. But the argument doesn't hinge on that, but it's massively confirmed by what was exposed when they went that route.
Sure. Yeah.
But for me, no, I mean, I vividly remember I was lying on the bed in my now wife's apartment in Paris reading a I mean, I'm sorry, this is the sort of person I am, reading a BIS report rather than out in Paris in an art gallery or enjoying myself with my now wife. I was reading a BIS report and I saw a graph.
We call those people.
Yeah, I saw a graph about the balance of payments. And when I saw a graph about the balance of payments, gross flows on the balance of payments, my earth, with my world, just think it was like a Copernican kind of like, shit, that's what happened. Like, whoa, this is totally different from what I thought. And hang on, if it's like this, then all of that other stuff, which I had been teaching as well, that was, you know, my bread and butter as a standard macroeconomist, that's all wrong. This is where this story is. And then once you have that kind of, I would say that all of my books have been motivated by like a single sort of aha move like that. Whoa, like, okay, so if it's like this, then like I was saying earlier on, let's try the thought experiment. Imagine if the world was that way rather than the other way, where would we end up? And what this graph showed was that if you look not at, as it were, the net flows of money into the United States, not as it were that what was left over after you netted inflow and outflow, but if you looked at the gross flows into the United States, the
massive
Europe, exactly. Globalization did not consist of America being harnessed to China. That happened, but the flows of money that result from that are relatively modest because they're actually to do with the real economy. And there's only so many plastic things that Walmart can sell from China. That generates a huge net deficit for the Americans. But if you actually look at the volume of money going back and forth, it's all between Europe and the United States. And that stops dead. It's like a heart attack. It's like a flatlining cardiogram chart in exactly when you would expect in the summer of 2008. And this is, so then the entire imagery is different, right? This is not a real side story driven by particular problems in the housing market. This is a collapse in confidence in a ordinarily balanced but gigantic financial flow on either side of the Atlantic. I always say it's a bit like, it's a bit like a seesaw, but with two elephants on it. Like, the seesaw is balanced, but we all know what the tension here is. If one elephant gets off, something terrible is going to happen. That is what the transatlantic financial system was like, precisely balanced. So you could say nothing to see here, let's move on. Or you could say what I see is two elephants holding each other in equilibrium on a high wire. Perhaps that's an even better image of an acrobat on a high wire balancing two elephants on a pole. That's kind of what the North Atlantic financial economy looked like in 2008. So it was seeing that image. And then once I had that image in my head, it was just dig on that. And then what happened, and this is really to answer your question, where does the grip come from, is that I'm an economist manqué, right? I didn't go through the hard school of American graduate school in economics, but I learned a lot of economics in Cambridge in the 80s. I worked with Wynne Godley, Frank Hahn, extremely serious, heavy hitters in the world of economic theory. I was a great apprentice of that theory. And I made a swerve, huge, big personal swerve out of economic theory. But Crashed was a book that took me back to, quite deep interest in economic theory and how we think about the economy. And when I saw that graph, the two things suddenly collided, because what this means is that, it is true, of course, that the Europeans deny this. So why are they denying this? Absolutely. In part, this is an intellectual problem. They don't understand the economics. And the economics is not standard macro. It's what we call macro finance. And there is an entire, as you know, an entire very dynamic school now of thinking about this, which I have ended up, as it were, as one of the Crashed helps anchor the politics of that movement. Because what you're doing there is showing how individual private balance sheets matter to the big story, right? These are not just matters of individual corruption by individual firms. In fact, they don't need to be corrupt at all. No one needs to engage in any kind of malfeasance. You don't need to dig up any secrets. No one's done anything wrong, and yet it's still lethally dangerous, right? So that, as it were, it's a kind of dangerous normality that you can see in this data. So that was one strand. And the other one was them thinking, as I have for decades now, about the very, very queer, very strange relationship between Europe and America. And this was one further instance of an entanglement, which was double-sided. You're right, as it were, the Europeans offshored this and were very happy in 2008 to say those nasty capitalists in America. Of course, we're different. We're not, that's not us. I mean, no one in Europe ever did anything like that. No, I mean, seriously, we weren't ever bankers like that. We never did derivatives like this. Isn't, not us, because we're all good social democrats or Christian democrats. But the other side of this is the Americans, of course, don't want to acknowledge this either, because if you recognize this, then what you discover is globalization is for real. In other words, the American economy is in fact totally imbricated with extremely dangerous. I mean, you call yourself a gentleman who, I mean, that's what, hooligan gentleman, gentleman who's great line. Like, that's essentially what European bankers were. I mean, they were out of control in America. The things they were doing were insane.
Absolutely.
Like Deutsche Bank was operating with effectively no capital in the United States on a, a bank with
immense leverage.
I mean, that was leverage on the whole balance sheet, but in their American operations, they literally had zero capital, right? And they would say, look, we live in a globalized world. The capital in Frankfurt is good. It'll be all right. And no one in America, I think it was like the number 6 or 7 largest bank holding company in the United States, and it had literally zero capital in the American operation. So it's very difficult for the Americans to admit, and things follow from that, which is that, and this is where we come to the story where investigative journalism in the true sense is really involved. The consequence of that, when it got real in 2008, is that the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, a national central bank answerable to Congress to a far higher degree than the ECB is to whatever it would answer to, European Parliament. So Congress actually does answer to, Fed does actually answer to Congress in quite a real way in a very polarized political environment. It had to act as a lender of last resort. In other words, provide liquidity. These are not bailouts. It's not putting capital in, but it has to provide lender of last resort support to the entire banking system of the world. More than half of the liquidity actions the Fed did were for non-American banks. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to digest, right? And of course, no one wanted to talk about it.
Which particular investigative?
It's a bunch. It was a team at Bloomberg. They had the resources of Bloomberg behind them. So these were not freebooters. This was a team at Bloomberg, and they sued the Fed for disclosure of the records which showed how much liquidity support the Fed did for which bank. And the Fed, of course, doesn't want to disclose this. And their argument is not political in the first instance, but operational. In other words, if we disclose this, there is reputational risk involved. And the banks will look weak. And if banks know in advance that their dependence on lender of last resort will be revealed, they'll be less willing to take the lender of last resort. And that's extremely dangerous, because the last thing you want in 0809 is a bank which is about to go over to the cliff, not asking for help. You want them all to ask for help immediately. In fact, you want them to take help even if they don't need it. And so, as it were, the journalistic imperative, the citizens' imperative of wanting to know conflicts with the operational imperative and the citizens' interest in financial stability. This was their argument. But they lost. The Fed pulled out of the case, but the clearinghouse of the banks, which is the Fed's partner in this, continued the case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found in favor of Bloomberg. And the Fed just dumped the data on Bloomberg, and Bloomberg then did the work of sifting through it. And they now publish much clearer reports about this. And so we can, for this particular, you can't get this for the ECB. There are researchers who've had it in anonymized form. Of course, the data exists on the various types of financial support the ECB has done for individual banks. And it would be very interesting to know, and one can infer, but the Freedom of Information case in the US exposed this. So you can track on a daily basis how much Paribas got, how much Deutsche Bank got, because they were literally getting dollar liquidity from the Fed. And then there's the whole other story of the swap lines, which is the central bank interrelationship, which was then also kind of revealed as if in relief. So that's how, one of the real kernels of the story emerged as a political story, but also as a technical, from that moment of going, oh my God, the balance of payments, when you look at it, it does not look like I thought. So if that's the case,
this was your aha moment.
But it's not a you know, it's not a secret conversation in a bar when someone says, you know, I've tried to have those kind of conversations, like what happened to the French banks actually in 2011? Will anyone tell you how deeply in trouble they were? And they, in my experience, lie. I mean, and I'm not telling this to people who haven't had this experience. You know, as a kind of rather naive, blue-eyed academic, I did not expect to be lied to in the way that I know I've been lied to about this question. Okay. So that wasn't part of the Crashed project, but it was something that spooled out of the Crashed project. And about that, people lie directly.
First question was how you prepare yourself for an aha-erlebnis. What kind of conditions need to be fulfilled in order to open yourself up to the unexpected, as it were, and whether Adam would be able to say something more general about that. And then the second question was about economics. Economics has this tendency to become very algebraic, model-oriented, whereas actually what you had the kind of skills and the kind of background knowledge that you need in order to be able to make sense of such a balance of payment statistics as a graph, as Adam was talking about a couple of minutes ago, is field-specific knowledge, which doesn't come naturally if you simply follow a course in Economics 101. You need to know something about the workings of economic institutions. You need to be able to read a balance sheet. You need to know how a bank functions. You need to know a little bit about what capital adequacy ratios are. They don't teach you that in economics. It has to be obtained by basically using some kind of theoretical background, but going into the field and simply, and meaning is use, is what Wittgenstein famously said. You get the drift of the meaning of these quite complicated technical concepts by simply going through an annual report. So I want to find out more specifically, in more detail, what kind of economic or economically based skills you, Adam, possessed, which one way or the other allowed you to have this aha-erlebnis while looking at a balance of payment flow graph from a very obscure Bank of International Settlement report. That's my question.
Well, it has to be said, I mean, it's Boyer and Dessayat's paper is now a classic in this world. So this is, you know, no longer by any means obscure.
No, sure.
When I read it, no, but when I read it, it was new out, and I think we were only really beginning to think through the implications. Both those questions are huge, difficult to think about. What was the best way of answering? I mean, I think
asking from you a bit of self-reflexivity about how you actually do the things.
Yes, no, obviously. The aha moments, I don't think there's any. I mean, but almost by definition, you know, if we had a formula for producing them, we would be, as it were, stripping them to a certain extent of the shock value that they have. It's easier for me to formulate it in the negative. So
yeah.
And it's part of my answer also to the second question. You know, I'm somebody who self-identifies as a left liberal, and that means that I'm in an almost constant dialogue with friends, colleagues, critics who are more to the left than me, and develop various types of heterodox economics, Marxist-inspired economics. And the interesting thing about those is, of course, that they're generally speaking inherently historical, and they're about making claims about modernity in various stages, at various moments. They're, as it were, ways of thinking about the structure of modernity and its dynamics. Or they would say capitalism.
Whom are you talking about?
Well, you could think, you know, there's an extraordinarily wide range now of people in MMT theory or in post-Keynesian economics or just classic new Marxisms of various type around journals like Historical Materialism or New Left Review. The folks that mobilized around the Syriza political economy, as it were, wing in 2014, 2015. And I have a huge amount of sympathy for the political position that they represent. And this is coupled with a degree of intellectual skepticism. And part of what I find, and this goes to this question of, as it were, novelty, part of what I find unsatisfying often about that way of founding a left politics and a left political economy is that in its own way, it is as classicist, as it were, timeless as the orthodoxies which it criticizes. And what I find, what has dynamized me across, as it were, at least the three books which are most dynamic in this respect. The first one, which was literally on the history of economics. It was in the history of macroeconomics, how in the early 20th century, this is my book about statistics, we constructed the data set through which we now still believe that we understand the world and the economy and this thing.
National accounts.
National accounting, balance of payments data. You asked me how I know about balance of payments data. Well, I kind of wrote a chapter about the emergence of balance of payment statistics in the 1920s, which were necessary for answering questions about the Versailles Peace Treaty. So when I see, the 2008 shock, I think, what is different about this picture than the one that we're familiar with for the last 100 years, talking about reparations payments, transfer problem, all of those kind of classic issues. And so what I try, insofar as there's a formula, it consists in what I actually take to be a kind of Marxian position, which is the place to look for novelty is in the knowledge being produced by the system itself. In other words, within the power knowledge complex of the establishment is where you are going to see almost by necessity, at least in its current configuration, and this can't be taken for granted throughout all of time, but if you think about the way in which Marx used factory inspectors' reports to get inside the factory, I think of those BIS data as our equivalent of factory inspector reports for understanding the way that financial capitalism works, right? And so I read them in that way, not uncritically, because they come out of that machine. But to go back to the original question, what I'm looking for is the moment when the most orthodox person working for the most orthodox organization says something totally extraordinary. That's for me the kind of, Jesus, I can't believe you working there just said that. That some left-wing friend of mine says something radical about the way in which capitalism currently operates, is why I'm interested in them, because they're very smart and they're very, charming, and I agree with their politics, and this is where we should be heading. But it's not surprising that they say something interesting when somebody working for the BIS presents you just flat out with a statement about how, for instance, Hyung Sung Shin, who's now the chief economist at the BIS, is a totally radical thinker. I have no idea what his politics is. And he worked, I think he's worked at Princeton, and now he's the chief economist at the BIS. He couldn't be a more establishment figure. But he's thinking about how capitalism operates. He literally says we should stop looking at national economic aggregates and regard the economy as the interlocking matrix of private balance sheets. A more sort of destabilizing understanding of how capitalism is very difficult to actually formulate. And then he goes on to say, and now what we need to do is understand the way in which the financial mechanics of that interlocking interconnect with the real economy. So he's not even, as it will remain, the new agenda of the people at the BIS is to try and see how supply chains generate different sorts of credit needs. And of course, they do it with access to databases, to inside sources that the folks on the outside are never going to have access to, unless they force their way in through freedom of information type stuff. And so those are the moves that I, kind of track. And I do it increasingly now. I've been doing this now for, God knows, 30 years, right? In a sense, within a sort of guesses about where this stuff might bubble up from, and with an alertness for when you ask, how do you generate these kind of moments, is I read a lot of stuff which on the face of it appears, surely it must be really, really boring. You should check out literally the ECB's financial stability review that came out this morning. And there is stuff in there which is astonishing. Just literally this morning. Go do it. It's an amazing it's an amazing thing. They have a graph, which shows, as it were, the nightmarish fiscal future of the euro area spelled out.
Is that also related to COVID-19?
Absolutely, it's the ECB tracking in real time the impact on the European economy. You know, all the major central banks do a financial stability report now. We live in a world sensitized. You know, we're in a Foucauldian regime of government organized around the notion of financial stability. This generates a continuous awareness of like catastrophic scenarios. They endlessly gain them in this exercise of so-called stress testing, and so they are like, so twin that with the IMF, which has now built a model which allows them to, without having internal access to the bank accounts. So unlike national stress testing, where you can actually send a bank regulator in and make sure, the IMF has done like a proxy version of this, where they can stress test indirectly for the 400 leading banks of the world and benchmark it against their macroeconomic model. And what that tells you is that in the adverse scenario that the IMF is sketching for the world economy, by 2022, 45% of the major emerging market banks could be underwater, could be below the safety threshold of 4.5% own capital, right? So buried in these reports are staggering assessments of the risk.
Is
that's the method to me. Like,
is that the first piece of advice you have to the audience of investigative journalists? Go to the boring reports of the most boring machine embedded organizations and look at the weird things that the functionaries of those organizations are saying.
Well, I mean, you know, I'm a tenured professor at an American private university. Like, I'm not chasing the story to sell to an editor the day after tomorrow. Right? That's not my problem. But, and I, of course, benefit from the kind of explosive investigations that folks who are taking a completely different type of professional risk produce. And I, you know, bow down before people who are willing to, you know, live on the edge like that, because it's clearly a precarity that I don't experience. So, but for me, there is something to be gained by a kind of complementarity between these two. You know, for a long time, for instance, like, it was clear that when the Bank of England was stress testing Chinese financial crises scenarios for the City of London, the City of London showed up as much more exposed than Paris and Frankfurt. And you have to ask yourself why that would be. And this is where then the investigative journalist comes in. Well, it's HSBC and Standard Chartered, isn't it? Because in the Bank of England's data, right, there's only two banks which could provide the link. And that's where I want the investigative journalist to go in and interview the people on the ground and do the dangerous work of exploring in Hong Kong how you navigate that line, how a bank like Standard Chartered or HSBC deals with its mainland Chinese, you know, operations. People can go to jail for that now. But if we're to understand and not nice jail, not Dutch or Belgian jail, Chinese jail, like that's where, for me, as it were, this macroscopic stuff intersects with, you know, frankly, very hard politics at this moment like this. And we know how hard that's being played out inside those organizations. And the number of, you know, even South China Morning Post has been doing brave work, I think, in you know, what must be very edgy circumstances there. But the FT, which I probably read most regularly, has done a series of very good reports on how stressed that situation is becoming. And clearly, to do that, you need a reporter that dedicates a substantial amount of their time to just tracking those super complex organizations, that has the contacts, that works the, you know, the telephones and the emails, and that can actually get the juice on what's happening between the mainland Chinese employees, the Hong Kong employees, and the expats working with those and those firms, you know, to actually really flesh out the story. The skill, insofar as I have a skill set, is to be able to tell you to the Bank of England report where they showed what difference that would make to the Bank of England's macro risk. And it's big.
So far, you've paid quite a lot of compliments towards investigative journalists who are willing to put their life on the lines, or at least the freedom on the line to obtain the information which is needed to tell a good, but also critical story about what is going on. But in general, what is your view of journalism? So if you take a larger view. My impression could be, for instance, that the type of skills that you need in order to read an annual report and become interested in the intricacies of contemporary derivative-based finance are so large that actually most journalists are put off by those particular types of technicalities and do other kinds of stuff. There are not that many journalists who are actually willing to go the whole length and tease out the different flows of money and where they ultimately end up. What is your view about that?
Well, I mean, I think of them as very close kin. Like I'm a storyteller, I'm an analyst, I'm engaged in the contemporary world, I'm interested in how it relates to the past. The good journalists I know are exactly the same. I don't see any difference at that level. And through medium like Twitter, I'm in literally daily personal interaction, DM, but also just pinging stuff of each other with journalists at all the major English-speaking financial media, FT, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and the intersection is so close that several of them have come to me and said, look, I'm thinking of writing a history book. What would you advise? One of them's actually I'm writing a reference for so he can enter a PhD program in history. And I consider that like it's no different than, I mean, I've got many graduate students as well who Nick Mulder who teaches at Cornell now, whose dad's a well-known Dutch journalist and who himself has published some, I gather, quite explosive stuff about Dutch, Belgian, Benelux, European politics. So I have like a kind of a complete, ecotope. And if I'm trying to write something about the debt restructuring ideas of this year, I mean, I'll check in with Jonathan Wheatley at the FT and just make sure that I've understood his reporting, because he wrote a great long read about that last week. And there was a quote in there from one of the UN Africa Commission people that really just kind of blew my mind. And so you check in. I mean, I really think they're and I mean, there was a day in April when I spoke to two separate offices in the Financial Times on the same day. I mean, because they wanted deep background or just background on some kind of story. So I think of us as being joined at the hip, really. I don't, and those people are savant, right? I mean, they are deeply immersed. And what I've understood more and more, largely, I think, through my own research and my own use of their sources, and then through Google, the great magic carpet of just tick, and then Twitter, is I've come to understand the mechanisms which generate that kind of reporting. So I'm reading the ECB's Financial Stability Review this morning because I know that's what the FT, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal people will be reading today as well. And I kind of want to beat them to it on Twitter, and there's some great graphs in there, and that is where a lot of the stories, a lot of the routine economic coverage in those kind of outlets is just driven by the reporting cycle of those things. Martin Wolf will in due course, write a long piece about the IMF's Global Financial Stability Report, because he'll read it, and it's and there's amazing stuff in there, like entire teams of people, at the IMF, brilliant economists in all of these organizations are working with superior access to data, and working for months on end to put these things together. Obviously, what I'm acutely aware of also, though, is the economics of all of this. Like, how does one make a living in journalism nowadays? How precarious, the sort of outlets I'm talking about, all have natural heavyweight constituencies, right? I mean, the folks who are subscribing to the FT, the Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg, and the Economist are not worried about the fact that it costs $500 a year or something to subscribe. Because it's peanuts, and for them, and they write it off on tax, and they simply can't do without the knowledge, right? And so the people in that kind of envelope are the privileged minority within a field
Absolutely.
which is otherwise just under a battering assault from the logic of platform economics and the loss of advertising revenue.
Yeah.
And so I'm also interested in the alternative, venues. I mean, Substack is a really interesting phenomenon. I've started a newsletter on it because I just kind of want to learn it by doing, see how it works.
I subscribe to your newsletter.
And I just started it thank you. I mean, I just started it like a week ago. I'm onto I have to do my 4th today. And so I'm kind of curious about how these ecosystems work, because ultimately what we're interested in, right, is investigation, overview, good writing. Yeah. And we've got to figure out how we make that sustainable for people. And there are some very positive dynamics potentially in the platform economy in terms of independence and autonomy. Yeah. And freedom from various types of intrusive editorial control and just the slowness of certain sorts of publishing.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there are obvious totally subversive dynamics which make it very difficult for people to actually earn a living. And that takes the basis out from under everything, and it also fragments the world, right? So how many Substack newsletters are people ultimately going to subscribe to?
And a more mundane question: how important is Twitter to you, and how do you actually select the accounts to follow?
Oh, it's I mean, it's essential to my life, has been for the last 5 years. I mean, I don't quite know how I existed before. It's a funny, it's a sad story of that. I mean, we were in Singapore. I mean, I was teaching at Yale's campus in Singapore, and I managed to fall down and break an ankle during a monsoon rainstorm. And I'm not a very good patient. And my frustrated teenage daughter, who was sort of desperate at my black mood, said, "Daddy, look, this'll occupy you." And she shoved me onto Twitter. And so I missed, as it were, the heyday of, the great blogging explosion of the early 2000s, and then the great commentary storm of 0809. I wasn't part of that world, and I feel very much the poorer for that. But in the writing of Crashed, it really became my sounding board. If you can make the argument stick in a few lines, and very smart people are all over it, you're okay. It's for me, it's like a daily seminar, really hot, very fast moving, great seminar.
And how do you select the accounts you follow? I haven't checked how much.
I have a lot. I mean, 4,000 or 5,000. I'm not one of the super selective people. I don't always follow back though, because I've got 104,000 followers at this point, so it would just be impossible.
Sure.
So it's driven by.
It also defeats the purpose.
Yes, exactly. So I reliant on TweetDeck to organize the stream, and I have, in a sense, it's not that different from any other kind of contact mechanism, right? These are people that you rely. I'm pretty assiduous. I do follow the stream, but so it's other people who are sharing interesting stuff, people who interesting people are sharing. So they're kind of vouched for. Sure. It's locational. I try to follow all of the key journalists at all of the key outlets, because they're very close to the the pipe. And that's what I'm interested in. And I'm a connoisseur now of writing, of this kind of financial writing, of political, geopolitical commentary. And so I'm curious about how other people do it. And and there are some people now whose careers I've followed, as they've risen up from, I don't know, there's that fellowship at The Economist a lot of people come out of, and you can see their careers track. Yeah. And it's good to be supportive of people like that. If they're doing good work, then, somebody with a big account like mine retweeting, their articles helps. And so you can be a good citizen, as it were, in this ecosystem by recirculating, by making things relevant. But it's become,
Now, you indicated that you use it as a sounding board, but is it also a source of information for you?
Oh, absolutely. No. I mean, it's just unless, I mean, yes, absolutely. And and I try to be a source of information reciprocally, right? I do a minimum really of pure opinion, really hardly any at all. It's always driven by, look, X has said something interesting about Y. Sometimes it's a skeptical, oh God, X has said that again. But it's always X has said something, or look at this graph, or it's very, I always want an intermediary position. I'm not in the business of just, but some people are artists at it and they're incredibly funny. Like my historian colleague, Quinn Slobodian, is, I think, just a genius at like tweaking and like, he'll have like 3 or 4 aperçus per day that are just, whoa, like, like,
same experience.
That's not my thing. It's Zeithistoriker is his handle, and like super follow. I mean, really, and it's related, and it's all about. I mean, obviously, he wrote Globalist, this fantastic book about neoliberalism.
Absolutely.
So, but I'm not. That's not my shtick. Mine is much more, look at this amazing graph from the ECB's financial stability report. You just can't believe it.
Did you already tweet that?
Yeah, that was all. I did a big browse through that this morning early.
You put it on Twitter.
Yeah. I haven't finished with that report. They're huge. I mean, but I'm going to write a newsletter. I'm kind of interested in genres now, so I'm actually going to do a newsletter later today, just very briefly comparing the Fed's, the ECB's, and the IMF's financial stability reports as documents, because they're interestingly different from each other. So it's kind of like a media, it's like a sort of, this thing that I think in American high schools they teach as sort of like media training, like how do you navigate this space? And but for the realm of financial commentary and research.
If you were an investigative journalist, what would what would the story be that you would like to trace?
Oh God. I mean, I'm very, very interested in the China dynamic and those HSBC Standard Charters. The folks, the corporations which are straddling that divide right now. I mean, that's a fantastically interesting world historic fissure to be in. And there's lots of different dimensions to it, obviously, from VW in Xinjiang to those banks we've mentioned to the big asset managers.
Yeah, sure.
There was an interesting piece in The Economist, actually, that started with the observation that if you wanted to have the phone put down on you by people who were ordinarily quite happy to talk to The Economist, the thing to ask about was how their business in China was doing. So, wake up, smell the coffee. The stories about, the big raw material booms. And again, I'm very interested in corporate power and its limits, and and I'm very fascinated by trying to figure out what they are and how far they go. And obviously, the world is massively asymmetric that way. So there are contexts in which corporate power relative to small, desperately poor, low-income developing countries is massive. Yeah. But then, if you're Rio Tinto Zinc and you're in the iron ore business, and you have people in China, you do not mess with the big Chinese commodity companies. Like, your executives end up in jail on trumped up charges of various types of things. They play bare knuckles. So it's that kind of interface between, as it were, let's call it our world of depoliticized, neoliberal, law-bound constraints on the one hand, and we shouldn't exaggerate that. I'm not saying that shenanigans don't go on here.
Sure.
And as it were, that other world of a kind of hard, soft power, this weird interface. The same, of course, could be said about dealings in Russia as well. That I find, absolutely fascinating, and we simply can't get at it without forensic, investigative, persuading people to talk about things which are really difficult to talk about. And this goes back, we haven't spoken about this, but I started out, I grew up in West Germany in the 70s and 80s. I was deeply influenced by Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the long, sustained German effort to come to terms with the Nazi past, which is one of the great achievements of public reason, I think, the West can boast of, right? It's not complete, of course, but it's a remarkable collective effort. And part of that was the history of businesses in the Third Reich, and they were amongst the slowest to come clean, to be clear. And they were amongst the most aggressive in pursuing investigative journalists and historians who worked hand in glove in the 70s, because it wasn't long ago then, right? In the 70s, it was only 30 years ago. The people were all still alive, most of them anyway. And books were published by historians which had entire chapters blacked out as a result of lawsuits by Siemens. And people were threatened in their livelihoods by, companies who legal officers would simply say, how much you're worth, how long do you want to spend in court, how bankrupt do you actually want to be by the time we're finished with you. And but of course, when you get inside the question is, how much power did companies actually have in the Third Reich? Because the premise of the left-wing muckraking monopoly capitalism theory of fascism is that they were the power behind the scenes and they were pulling the strings, and that's not true either, right? So that's, to my mind, completely unconvincing as an account of how the Third Reich functioned. So that problem of how we, and the meta problems which arise from that, within which historical frame do we put this, right? Because the companies want you to frame this as a story of constraints. In other words, how were we blackmailed, coerced by the government to act, right? And on the other hand, the Marxist theories want to ask, how were the politicians manipulated by big capital to quite implausible things like start World War II, which has never struck me as like a very reasonable business proposition. But we laugh. But then, of course, maybe it was like, if the aim is to conquer the Netherlands and Belgium, then obviously people could get rich doing that. And when they had conquered, we know that the feasing frenzy started. But we also know how difficult it actually turned out to be to carve up Arbed, and how SocGen somehow managed to somehow wiggle out underneath and not get divided up, right? And so there are incredibly difficult, or Philips, for instance, how it managed to offshore its IP, and there are extraordinarily complex logics here that have informed my thinking about this problem all along. And you start out as a historian of the Third Reich interested in political economy with the Nuremberg trial records. You start with the IG Farben case. That's where you learn to think about this problem and its complexities. And that's what I want about HSBC or VW or, Apple at this moment. Of course, we'll never get it. Unless they go bankrupt, or if they're hauled in front of a court somewhere, we will never see, I don't think we will ever see that material.
This reminds me of what you said when we started out this interview about the rails, which allow you to travel pretty quickly from IG Farben to HSBC in 2020. And that's very nicely put. I now would like to move to the third part of the conversation, which is basically about the current conjuncture. As I already indicated, on the back of Crashed, you have become some sort of a global public intellectual. There are a couple of you, Mariana Mazzucato, Thomas Piketty, and all the rest of them. Naomi Klein, also
Branko Milanovic.
Branko Milanovic, but it may also be Quinn Slobody and people like that. They're read all over the place, and they make increasingly public interventions, which in some instances are outside of the scope of what they have academically done, which is, in my sense, it's a good thing. And you have increasingly given commentaries on all sorts of current affairs for a whole range of outlets, ranging from the London Review of Books to the Guardian, from the Financial Times to Foreign Policy, etc., etc. And if you sort of have a look at some of your publications, there are a couple of themes which pop up again and again. One of them is the relationship of the United States and also Western Europe to China. We've been covering some of these topics already during the conversation. But one of the things that I find quite striking is that, again, this is balance of trade statistics. And according to these balance of trade statistics, China has become the largest exporter in the world. But nevertheless, there's also this other narrative, and that's a narrative of global supply chains, where at least part of the nodes, the manufacturing nodes, are located in China, but the actual logistical and also financial management of those supply chains is still very much located in Western Europe and North America, which it's very hard to combine those two images. And one of your publications in The Guardian this year, on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic measures, was about what could be called, with Michael Mann, the infrastructural power of the United States. The swap lines, provided by the Federal Reserve, which ensured that the sudden stop in real economic activity didn't result in a financial meltdown. And perhaps you can say something about how we should, one way or the other, envisage the rise of China and the decline of the United States in the light of some of these infrastructural powers, which still very much seem to be dominated by US institutions and organizations.
So, I mean, huge question, lots of different strands there. I've been preoccupied with the America's power, across all of my work, essentially. And that initially was a set of questions about Europe and the United States, which, unsurprisingly associated with, we're roughly the same age. The world that we grew up in was one that, to my mind at least, I was not part of, say, the post-colonial British society, which is a thing, families that were marked by empire. Mine wasn't. So I was marked by Europe and the United States. And so that has been sort of the ambit of my thinking. But you only have to look at the sort of data that I use to sort of generate my shocks, as it were, and the biggest shock ever, full stop, ever, in any of the data ever, is what's happened to China. And I say that in a kind of like childish way, but we have to not downplay the scale element
of the transformation.
I mean, it's just like nothing we've ever seen before, and it's profoundly, I think, wrong-headed. It's not Eurocentric as was what you'd say, but that's kind of doesn't quite capture how wrong-headed it is. Like, it's even more wrong-headed than that. Like the China doubled the world's production of steel in the 12 years between 2002, roughly, and 2013. So take the entire history of the Industrial Revolution all the way back to the 18th century. Of all of the entire world, the story of the Ruhr, of Pittsburgh, of Lancashire, and in the UK, all of that together, Japan, Korea, all of it together, and double it in 10 years. Match it in 10 years in one country. If you look at the climate side, we didn't think what was going to happen in the early 2000s was going to happen, except the only people who really did were the American climate negotiators at Kyoto that everyone loves to hate. Their position right from the very beginning was like, there's no point in us doing this deal Kyoto style, because what's going to happen next, which is that China's coming. And when China comes at the pace it's coming, the CO2 budget just blows out, which is what happened. Right. So, and if you look at the story of 2008, if you look at the largest stimulus, it's China. So I'm not a Chinese specialist, and I'm never going to learn how to read Chinese. And I am I'm acutely sort of aware of my outsiderness. But even writing, Deluge about World War I, it was evident that an understanding of modern history, which doesn't a modern world history that doesn't include China, has always been sort of laughably inadequate.
Yeah, sure.
This is true of World War II, in which after the Soviet Union, the largest number of casualties were suffered by the Chinese in their war against Japan. It's true of the Cold War, which you can't understand either the beginning, the middle, or the end of without understanding China. And so for me, it's now kind of like rest of life task is to at least be moderately competent and commenting on these shifts, right? But then how do we fit this within a frame? And I think the basic idea, in answer to your question and to come now to the sort of interstices of it, rather than my like aperçu, would be, I think it's pretty clear that if we are dealing with a power shift, it's not going to look like the model that we saw between the UK and the US in the early 20th century, right? In which, as it were, there is a global empire, itself an extraordinarily weird construction. Obviously, the Dutch and the Belgians and the French and the British were part of the construction of these very weird, ultimately early modern empires, small European states, balancing massive, weird, heterogeneous, very far-flung global empires, of which the British was by far and away the largest, collapsing suddenly, imploding on themselves because gravity in the end takes its toll. Replaced by a single compact nation state which faces both the Atlantic and the Pacific, with the most dynamic capitalist economy that the world had seen up to that point, after 2 exhausting European wars. That configuration, well, fingers crossed, it's not what's happening next. Right? I always say to people when they say they want another Bretton Woods, do you know when Bretton Woods was and who was there and who wasn't there? It's like the month after D-Day and in the middle of Operation Bagration, in the middle of World War II, and it's a wartime meeting. Is that really your idea of where we're going to?
Yeah, sure.
No, because Bretton Woods is a free-floating signifier for a nice meeting where wise people decided something positive about the world economy. Like, it has no relation to the historical event. So that is not what's going to happen next. So I guess my thinking about this is, how do we disaggregate power enough to be able to encompass what is clearly going to be, as it were, what a Trotskyite would call an uneven and combined shift, which is what the kind of world that we're in, I think. And so in certain dimensions, the shift has already happened. Right? This is the significance of Xi's climate announcement this year. Climate politics globally is not about the West anymore. We can follow along if we like, and it'll be great if we do, and there's no solution if we don't. But the lead player is China, because China's CO2 emissions are the same as Europe's and America's put together. So already China is driving the entire story. In other areas, as you say, though I would be cautious about that supply chain story, that is emphatically the story 15 years ago. But as China has developed, that story about, as it were, the master narrative of Chinese development being that it's a kind of offshoring of Western development is true of only a small segment of the Chinese economy. Like, the most of its exports are now essentially organized internally by themselves, or through complex East Asian networks, which Apple kind of piggybacks into. But the South Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese, Taiwanese network is pivotal to all of that. The Taiwanese chip factories are really, say, key, or Samsung is a key player in that network. Or most of Chinese production is for its own domestic consumption, right? So that's one side of it. But then on the other hand, we have, as it were, the overarching power of the American military, which is still non-pareil in the world and is highly dynamic and innovative. In weird, as Mary Kaldor would say, Baroque arsenal, it's all kind of crazy, but they do produce innovation at a pace no one else, only the Russians still are able to really match them, I think. And then there's the tech domain, where, again, there are no European platforms to speak of, right? And those platforms in the US are not, of course, American in any simple sense. They're corporate platforms made by radically multinational workforces out of California, entirely profit-driven. They'd really like to operate out of Switzerland if they could, but it's not an option. And then there's finance, and finance is the thing that, is in a sense the weird hybrid of both totally globalized in one dimension and radically national in the sense that we operate in a fiat currency world since 1971, 73, and the biggest, most comprehensively distributed currency globally is the American national currency. And so in extremis, when we are in a liquidity shock, it all piles down, pyramids up to America's central bank, which we were talking about. So all of these shifts are happening simultaneously, and what we can see, and there are moments, as it were, of disaggregation, where a kind of liberal logic prevails, which says, let's break all this apart, separate all the pieces, neutralize the relations between them, and proceed on that basis, which I think is the ideal model of the 90s and the 2000s. Which was, I think, in the end premised on unipolar American dominance. In other words, no one could contest their military power, so no one was going to contest, so it didn't matter what happened in the other fields. And what's been remarkable this year is that we have seen an emphatic bundling project on the American side. It's always been clear, I think, that the Chinese regime is in fact in the bundling business. They don't accept the liberal distinctions between the technological domain, the legally regulated market, the state domain, national security, individual rights. It's not part of their governance matrix. What we've seen for the first time this year is that kind of, in fact, the last year or so, is that kind of closure beginning to happen on the United States side. So a more Cold War model where tech is defined with security, is aligned with national sanctions operated by way of the control of the dollar system, and all of it actually explicitly motivated by ideological positions that people like Attorney General Barr, Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo have been articulating. And it goes all the way down. I mean, I don't know whether this has happened in Europe, but as an academic in Columbia, I received an email from the legal office of Columbia University, and this is an American institution, so the lawyers are the people who run it.
Yeah.
Saying this is a list of 14 Chinese universities and institutes that you must not have any contact with, except with prior consultation with us. And Renmin University was on that list. So one of the biggest universities in the world. There was also the Chinese Military Institute of Aeronautics. Unsurprising, perhaps, that we weren't supposed to talk to them. But Renmin. So not McCarthy, not Cold War yet, but rather comprehensive redefinitions of our relationships. And this, these are universities across the United States with hundreds of thousands of Chinese students. Right? This is not a small, isolated population. Many of our courses would simply not operate without students from China, all of whom I think we have to accept are probably subject to massive coercive pressure from Chinese state security.
And stuff like that,
and by each other in part, and
I want to end with a final question, which is sort of speculative. And we've had this, and this is brilliantly described by Quinn Slobodian in the book Globalists. And we're living in this global world order, where the order of the market, the legislation of the markets, I have to say in plural, is as much depoliticized and de-democratized as possible. So this is a world where the IMF, the World Bank, but also the European Union and the European Commission with the internal market, the World Trade Organization, the other Bretton Woods institution, the World Trade Organization, the international dispute and settlement systems, the arbitrage courts, etc., etc. They, one way or the other, are the key sort of infrastructural institutions which make possible the world in which a multinational employment workforce is able to produce our iPhones. And this is seen to be massively disrupted by COVID-19 and these particular types of measures, which one way or the other, both at the national and at the supranational level, have set in motion a series of question marks and thinking and reflections on the future of this particular world order. So to put it very briefly and succinctly, is COVID-19 launching the end of neoliberalism and the neoliberal world order as we know it?
I thought this is a preoccupying question, not the least because I'm actually trying to write a book about the crisis of this year.
That is the project that you have.
Yeah, and it's a very urgent project. So
yeah, absolutely. When are you supposed to finish it? Because
mid-February. So to a journalistic timescale. The colleagues on the phone call will appreciate the challenge.
Who is going to be published?
The usual suspects.
Okay.
Yeah, the people who've published me before Penguin. And,
sure.
So I mean, I think there's three different ways of thinking about neoliberalism, and one is as a sort of ideology and ideological frame. Another is as a set of practices that demarcate the boundary between the state and the economy, the public and the private, the political and the unpolitical. And the third is really a sociology, a class politics, if you like.
The people behind it.
The people behind it and the interests that they represent and the social structure that they are interested in creating. And again, my answer is going to kind of differentiate between these different levels, right? In the sense that and you can start at one hand and go to the other. If you're looking at the ideology as a sort of coherent frame, it is dead. And what's interesting is to see, this is why, again, reading boring reports that say interesting things. Last year's BIS annual report, tombstone to the Washington Consensus. I mean, literally buried here. And they literally say, theory has lagged behind practice.
Yeah.
It's just like, you've grown up like Marxists. It's just, I can't believe they said this. Like, theory lags behind practice. Let us provide a summary of what the emerging markets are actually doing beyond the Washington Consensus. And it's basically like a kind of Beijing light is the model, right? So that's, and it's increasingly been formulated. It's called the IMF. The IMF even has a phrase for it now. It's called something like the new synthesis or something. And it's basically massive exchange reserves, macroprudential regulation of a preventative kind, and a toleration of capital controls if necessary. Like, they're all that. It's amazing. So that's kind of gone, and no one's in that game anymore. And it's really dead dark. Neoliberalism as a practice always combined a duality, right? And Quinn captures one side of this, which is the ordering, structuring, dividing side. But of course, it was always, and David Harvey is great on this, always had the sort of Schmittian alternative, which is state of emergency, state of exception, crisis, act now, intervene. And there's a weird way in which Europeans sometimes don't get this, because in a sense, because, as it were, the brand of ordoliberalism that Germany in particular, they actually drank the Kool-Aid and have created a system which they think doesn't have the crises that require the interventions. And so they actually sort of, I think Schäuble actually deep down does believe that you never do the interventions, right? I mean, or except only in very rare instances. Whereas, of course, America, it's like, give them half a chance and they flip into Clausewitzian mode, and they're all first responders and, soldiers coming to the rescue of the Republic, and,
we will hunt them down,
dirty hands.
Them out.
Yes, dirty hands. Look at my, I have taken upon me the great burden of violating all of the neoliberal rules, but, I stand for what's necessary. I mean, it's incredible, the cultural difference. And so that is resistant to this. It can't ever fail, right? Because it's always going to be a duality. So are the interventions of this year a total radical refutation of neoliberalism, or the radical confirmation of the fact that absolutely everything can be mobilized to keep the show on the road if necessary? This is why I find Keynes ultimately the most satisfying neoliberal, because he would describe himself as a new liberal, not neo, but new. And his general theory is a more capacious description, because he was on the one hand the creator of orders like Bretton Woods, and on the other hand, the arch theorist of intervention. That's why it's a general theory. It can understand both the general and the rule and the exception, right? It's a much more flexible framework. So if you're thinking in theory terms, I think, Keynes is for me the great antidote to Schmitt. You have a dog at your end. I
have a dog in the room, and I'm going to let her out, because, so if you have a moment.
Yes, I'll pause. Yeah. But the third dimension in which nothing has changed is class politics, right? I mean, if neoliberalism was about creating a social structure, then 2020 has, the shock of 2020 is one of the most explosively divisive, socially inegalitarian, radically polarizing shocks we could possibly imagine. And it has played out as any child of the 70s, 80s, and 90s would predict it would play out, right? That doesn't mean that we're not capable of innovation. And the European innovations of the European welfare state model have been quite extraordinary with regard to short-time working, for instance. Likewise, in America, despite themselves, they suddenly proved that with a big, generous welfare spending package, you can actually prevent people from becoming poor. It came as quite a shock to the Americans, right? This summer, in the middle of Corona, there were probably fewer poor people in the US than last year. Because they simply seized the reins of the fiscal state and sent everyone a check. And they sent poor working class Americans on low wages checks, which were so big that they were much more than they could have earned by working in the same period. And this then horrified the Republicans, who suddenly rediscovered incentives and said, what have we done? Oh my God, we've undermined like the entire structure of labor. But for a brief moment, they did this. But that doesn't mitigate the fact that Jeff Bezos has gotten rich as he has. Like us who can do our work, the top 10% of employees who have not been, we live in nice apartments, in nice houses.
Absolutely.
It doesn't affect us. But if you are in one of the exposed sectors, you're exposed to risks. At that level, nothing's changed about this shock, except that we have demonstrated certain capacities to cope with it.
I take from this that you have sort of given us a brief summary of your forthcoming book.
I'm still knitting.
What's the title going to be?
It's going to be called Shutdown in English, because I don't like lockdown, because lockdown is that liberal frame. Some big beastly nanny state came along and told me that I couldn't go to work. And there's a lot of book about prisons called Lockdown as well, like graphic novels about prisons. Whereas, as we know, and again, very interesting thing in a very boring report, the IMF has actually done econometrics to evaluate the balance between voluntary self-distancing and state-imposed pressures. And you can do tricky econometrics to try and gauge this. And for the advanced economies, it's completely unambiguous that at least 60% of the reduction in mobility was driven by choices made independently of government orders. Okay. So for a historian, this is mind-blowing, because it means that there would have been, as it were, the recession, whether or not there had been government decisions.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Right? So the entire politics then becomes very different, because then what is the government doing? Well, in a sense, I think, if you look inside corporations, it's very interesting, much neglected. Like, so the auto industry bargained the shutdown between the employers and the trade unions, and then asked government to help pay for it. Yeah. Okay. So it's a classic corporatist kind of. So rather than the state being this ghastly liberal, nanny that's come along to force everyone to stay at home and wear masks and not live out the freedoms of all, take your pick. Dutch people, Belgian people, British people, Americans, like all our freedoms have been infringed. Actually, what's happening is this much more complex, much more realistic political economy in which the governmental apparatus and the state machine. I mean, of course, there are elements which are coercive. This isn't to deny that, but
closing the schools, for instance,
the generality is a sort of much more complex symbiosis. In the US, the school closures are driven. Even the school closures are driven very powerfully by withdrawal of parents and by go slow by the teachers. Right, so the teachers just didn't show up to work in Manhattan beyond a certain point. So. The state is, if you like, ratifying choices that are being made by labor and by consumers,
rather than enforcing.
At least we need to open ourselves to that. There are other cases. India is the case in point, right, where you really do have a extraordinarily sharp coup, a real crash. But anyway, so it's called Shutdown, and it should be out by September next year.
Okay, looking forward to that. We now have it's unbelievable. We have exactly 15 minutes left for Q&A.
Perfect timing.
It's unbelievable. Just a call to the audience. Post your questions through the chat function, and I will read them out loud, and Adam will answer. There is already one on the chat function, which is by Tanya van Bergen. The margin of error of the kind of predictions that are being produced by the IMF. The attempt one way or the other to bring to the fore the systematic relationship which exists at a global level. Do they know what they're talking about, and does their econometric hold up? One case in point would be, for instance, the predictions that they made about GDP growth in the context of the Greek crisis. We've seen 15 or even 20 new predictions, which all got worse than the former ones, which sort of indicate, well, hey, their econometric models are not up to the task. Are they? Have they learned their lessons?
Well, no, as you may know, so this goes back to these questions about political engagement. Because I'm not a citizen of the United States, I can't vote here. I don't engage in party politics in that sense. But one of the campaigns that I've been involved with a bunch of academics, but also people, say, from the IIF, which is the lobby group of global finance, is a campaign about precisely this issue of so-called output gaps. So we have this campaign called CANU, which doesn't make any sense. I was very sleep deprived when I came up with the acronym, but it's stuck on Twitter, so now that's what it's called. Campaign Against Nonsense Output Gaps. It should be CANOG, but it's CANU. It's precisely getting inside those kind of calculations and questioning them. So when I say read boring reports and find interesting things, I'm not saying read them uncritically and, abandon all skepticism. One of the interesting things that you will find, exactly as this question suggests, is repeated and sustained, utterly counterfactual, perversely wrong-headed predictions over and over and over again, on which rather important decisions are then premised. I mean, you point to the IMS ones with regard to Greece, which I think one has to regard as a sort of, they're essentially the sort of infrastructure of a political bargain in which basically, I don't think they asked the economists to produce the numbers so that they can close the deal. But there is a sort of symbiotic relationship between the production of a certain sort of 50-year forecast for Greek GDP, so you can calculate the glide path under which Greece will achieve, Eurozone's conformity by 2060 or something. I mean, this is instrumental reasoning. The other one that, a lot of us have been battering on about is the ECB's inflation forecasts, which look like an eyelash. As inflation slumps and we head closer and closer towards deflation in the Eurozone, every time the ECB economists are predicting, no, it's going to accelerate. It's going to be a problem every single time. And we keep going down, and you have to ask what's going on. You have to, but you can't ask that unless you start at this level of argument. So I'm very, sympathetic to the kind of work that somebody like Yanis Varoufakis has done. I mean, he's not really an investigative journalist, but by by taking a tape recorder to certain meetings and taking his iPhone, and it was astonishingly eye-opening. I'm not sure whether it's good politics. I'm not sure it necessarily is the best, as it were, strategy for saving Greece. That's a very complicated political calculation, which I'm not qualified or entitled to make, right, as an outsider, because the risks are real for real people on the ground. Yeah. But the sort of work somebody like that, inside the machine like that, can do in both encountering, working against, and explaining what's going on is essential. And that's, one of my great heroes is Daniela Gabor, who is, just this genius counter expert of macro finance, very involved in European politics. She gives evidence to European parliamentary committees. She works the inside of, just blew today the story, right, of the BlackRock advice. Yeah, absolutely. This surprisingly cheap bid to give you X, how much of BlackRock's time do you think 280,000 euros buys you on the regular clock, like an intern for 20 hours or something? It's ridiculous. That's her, métier. But that kind of counter expertise is what democratic politics, critical, progressive democratic politics, has to have now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
It has to work at that level.
I got a couple of other more practical questions. One from Koen van der Ven. Did you come across mistakes made by journalists during the arc of the crisis?
Mistakes. I think what you let me percolate. One thing you can see is I don't keep tabs. I'm not looking to trip people up. I don't I approach this with a sense of really deep humility, and I know I get things wrong. I'm sure other people get things wrong. What is interesting to me is narrative framings, and how they percolate. And what I see all the time is people, I think, misframing a problem. You can see really contentious kind of framings, which are unconscious. People just, as it were, produce that. I don't really want to name names right here, right now, but we're all aware of the way in which that will creep into an account. And it works in different directions. Somebody with my political disposition will continuously spin a story one way. And there aren't that many publications which are balanced in the sense that they can fully represent both perspectives unless they bring somebody in as a voice. So you just have to be a knowledgeable reader of that kind of publication, right? Most famously, perhaps The Economist, right? But it's brilliant. An extraordinary. I think they're going through a purple patch in terms of their editorial skills and their writing right now. Yeah. I read it religiously, but you hold it here. You go, oh, this is what you're, because because it comes with a line, and you have to be aware of that, and that will lead people sometimes to fundamentally misjudge a situation. And it runs both ways. I mean, the reporting of something like the New York Times, which frankly I don't read that much, but its reporting on Europe is quite haphazard. And and I think serious American political journalists also find a lot of European reporting on American politics.
What is the best newspaper if you want to track and trace events in financial markets, financial-based news?
No doubt. I think still the FT. Yeah. I mean, no. There's a single go-to source. Indispensable, especially now. I mean, it's got this tie-up with Nikkei, Asian Review, so they have great reporting on Asia. I mean, I like the Wall Street Journal, I have to say. I say that somewhat to my surprise because I'm so not aligned with its politics, but they have outstanding journalists, particularly industry journalists. So if you're interested in big commodities, for instance, their commodity reporting is outstanding. They have great people covering central banks. They're very good people in Europe as well. But I mean, I basically triangulate Bloomberg, FT, Wall Street Journal. But
a Bloomberg subscription is especially expensive, isn't it?
Not a terminal. I mean, the terminal is $5,000 a year, but no, just their news feed is. I don't think it's that much more than The Economist or something like that.
Okay,
and it is very rich, and again, very market driven and extraordinarily global, as you would expect. In fact, if you didn't, I mean, I think it would be for me a toss up between Bloomberg and the FT.
Okay, and what do you make of FT Alphaville, this special subsection on the FT website, which has all this more wonky stuff?
Oh yeah, I mean, they're one of the great hubs where academia, practitioners, journalists have intersected, and they exploit the medium of the blog and the profile and platform of the FT in a really ideal way. And if you think about the people who've been through that, the journalists who've written from them, obviously Isabel Kaminska is kind of the anchor for a long time, but Klein, Garcia. I mean, they were they go through passages of more or less focus, and it's kind of a little bit playful. So sometimes the line is not of interest. If you're not particularly interested in British university finance, there's going to be a whole bunch of posts on there which aren't going to be top of stack for you. But it's one of the places where that hub, that intersection between those different fields, really full-on academia, the international financial institutions, the practitioners, the Zoltan Pozars at Credit Suisse or something like that, and journalism have been most fertile. And so kudos to them. And I mean, it's a little bit like the model that, Ezra Klein and all of those people did, Want Blog. It's that model that the Americans pioneered in the early 2000s and then took off in the finance world a little later on, of a very sort of research, fact-driven, fairly uncompromising kind of reportage.
We got 4 minutes left, and I want to
be brief.
And I will be brief with regard to the questions. Jeff Portmans, hi Jeff. How do you do that? Getting good pieces out of boring reports. Do you have any kind of routine which allows you to distill the relevant from the irrelevant, the boring from the interesting?
So I mean, you need to know the dates of the publications, and you check in. And they're regular and they follow a rhythm, and it has to do with the spring-autumn meetings of the international institutions. And once you've kind of understood that, then everything else kind of falls into place, because everyone, as it were, piggybacks. The attention window is there. And so a lot of the NGOs and other people also focus on that moment. So you have to sort of brace for intensive reading at certain times of the year, and then you can chill in other periods. There are a great working paper series coming out of things like the central banks and the BIS, which just go back to every couple of weeks and see what's come out. Twitter feeds provide, as it were, updates on those. And then I have to say that it's kind of bad, but my main, the first surface cut is just to look at all of the charts. You don't read the text. It's too slow. And so the FT has created this new graphics view where you can just look at the charts and not look at any of the articles. So for somebody of, I think very graphically. I'm passionate about art history. It's my great hobby, and I'm like visual to a very high degree. So that's what I'm looking for, is that kind of moment where all of a sudden it's the balance of payments in a way I haven't seen it before. And it's like, whoa, that can't be that way. No way, hang on, there must be something wrong. And I am now, like, that's, one of the beauties of having this sort of Twitter thing is that you can ping them. So I've like, you can copy, edit, and correct people as you go along. But that is, I think, the way to do it quickly is to check. And it's a habit. You have to do it regularly, and once you acquire that habit, it's easy.
Yeah. We have Koen.
Yes.
Joining us. We're running out of time.
The reason for that is we have already experienced this afternoon how rigid the system can be. So there's this time ticker which ends in 2 minutes. And,
okay.
If we are not being kicked out by then, we can maybe ask another question. But just before, just to prevent a sudden stop from happening, I want to be sure to really thank you, both of you. I think it was great. I think many people thought it was great. I received some other messages while this was happening. I think it was a great encouragement to not only read into economists at the flanks of political debate, but also to really scrutinize what happens in the center. We just heard that if you pay some attention to what is in the what the odd things are in the reports by the so-called boring institutions, we can even find announcements there of the death of neoliberalism, for example.
Sure. So I think the IMF did that.
Yes, it's a great encouragement. I think that we all do it. I think we heard some other thing that we should all do, and that is subscribe to the newsletter by Adam Tooze. I think that's
absolutely
we should all do after this. And also for you, Adam and Ewald, for both of you, I think it's also good to note we could see who attended this event. That were journalists from everywhere in the Netherlands and Flanders, from the biggest newspapers. There was actually somebody from Bloomberg, which was just mentioned, the correspondent in The Hague. So we had really a big crowd. We also lost a couple of people along the way due to technical problems. Sincerely sorry about that. Also for the people who were left out because of that. The good news, though, is we have recorded everything, and that will be distributed among all the members of the VVOJ. And I'm pretty sure that will be watched a lot. I actually got that question a lot. Like, I'm being kicked out now. Can I watch this back? Then, last but not least, thank you all for watching. Adam, thank you for being here. And well, thank you for hosting this. And we are very much looking forward, I think, to shut down. That's for sure.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Briefly before, I think because nothing seems to happen with this time ticker there. So I briefly want to welcome everybody who's going to follow the rest of the conference. We'll start tomorrow at 10. So please be there. We have wonderful other keynote speakers. We have lots of debates. You can all find them on our website. So we see you there. And I think now, because I interrupted you, maybe there's time for some last question. And I think then we can really end. But for now, already, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. I think that it was nice and okay like it is. We spent 2 hours. It was an exhilarating journey. I learned a lot, and it was very, very nice to see you live talking instead of writing. I follow most of your writings, but it's always nice next time around when I read something from you, I will hear your voice, which is always a great experience.
Likewise.
Yeah, and
it's a real pleasure, Ewald.
And good luck with this new project, which is basically like Crashed, because it is again history in the making, which requires you to basically follow the course of this thing, which is very hard to predict where it's going to go to next, what the next move will be, and again it requires you to collect all sorts of data and information and reports, which of course come from a completely different discipline. This is not finance. There is, of course, a political economy here, but it requires you also to become acquainted with the epidemiological language and the virological language. But I'm sure it's in good hands with you.
We shall see. We shall see.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, and have a nice nice rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, Koen. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.